I'd like to propose that we bring on people who themselves went through these experiences. So bring on people from different communities and religions who themselves were saved or were brought to safety by someone of an opposite community or religion, and hear their stories, because there's real power in them. And especially in today's world where there's so much polarization, I think being reminded of that humanity and kindness is important, and it's an important narrative of partition that shouldn't be forgotten.
Malika, I'm getting the vibe very strongly. Sell one story to us. Pitch us one story. You say, for example, so many stories like this one. Tell me one that's going to grab our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So an experience I heard just 2 days ago is of this boy who was, very young when partition happened, less than 10 years old. A mob had grabbed him, and in this case, it happened to be a Muslim mob, but you hear stories of the same thing happening on the other side. And a neighbor came and basically told the mob, "Don't kill this boy. I will adopt him. I will convert him." And he just managed to dissuade the mob and send them away, and then later took the boy back to his family. Even in the museum, we've got another story where there was a woman who got separated from her family, and an elderly gentleman took her from camp to camp to camp for weeks till he could reunite her with her family. In this case, it was a complete stranger. I mean, he had no incentive to do that except for just the humanity, and recognizing that here was a human being in need and helping her. And we see that in every situation.
Sure.
And I think these stories should not be forgotten.
So Malika, I love that. And of course, I know people love heartwarming stories because the news is full of the opposite, but I want to direct your attention to these two tweets we got. So we conducted a Twitter chat before this show, and we asked, how did your family experience the 1947 partition, and how is it remembered? Mersey writes in, my grandmother tells me that it was a lot of bloodshed on both sides. He goes on to say that his grandmother says it was the most devastated time in her life. She was afraid of being kidnapped. So I'm going to direct this to Bina. Thinking of Malika's pitch, does it do it justice to only talk about the positives? Do you think enough people know about this bloodshed that Mersey here is tweeting about?
I think enough people do know about that bloodshed that Mersey is tweeting about. I think that's the narrative that we hear most often, is about the bloodshed and the violence. And in fact, Anam, I'm sure she'll talk about this. She grew up hearing about just how awful the other side was. And there's so many people who hear about just how awful the other side was, but you just don't hear about the good things that are happening, or the humanity that those same people who experienced the trauma, how they experienced also good things. And for example, Salman Rashid, he's a photographer and travel writer in Lahore, and he talked about half his family was butchered in a small village in Punjab. And he finally, after many tries, he got a visa to go back there, and he met one man who was actually the son of the man who had killed his own family, who had killed Salman's family. And they connected, and they remained connected because he said that this was the only link I have to that past of mine. And that man, who was a boy at the time of or was probably not even born at that time, or he was a young boy. But he and Salman connected, even though that man's father had butchered Salman's family. Then, I think that it's very important to focus on that humanity, especially now when all around the world we are seeing the narrative of hostility and bigotry, and actually a fascist narrative rising up right now, which reminds me of partition, of what happened at that time.
Okay, Bina, so let me just check in to see what everybody else thinks about this idea. I want you to be really candid. Would you watch this on TV, Anna?
Yes, I would. I couldn't agree more, actually. Research has shown that 40% of partition stories are actually rescue stories. The thing is that India and Pakistan are so bent upon describing and creating these state identities which are in opposition to the other, that very complicated, nuanced experiences of partition, where you had intercommunal tensions but also intercommunal bonds, get packaged into these very simplistic binary linear versions. So school children, for instance, and that's been my focus, never hear of these rescue stories. For them, they don't even come across an Indian or Pakistani or a Hindu or Sikh in Pakistan. So they become these figments of the imagination. It is so important to start to humanize this dehumanized, monstrous other.
All right, we're going to move on, but gentlemen, just a thumbs up or a thumbs down for this story? Thumbs up or thumbs down? A yes or a no?
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up?
Absolutely.
Shanaz?
Yeah, thumbs up. Yeah, can I
right.
say something now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we will continue to remain rutted in
My
the
head?
human rights side of the problems of partition. We will continue to write books. We will continue to create more museums about it unless we address the fundamental questions like why it happened and what can be done to prevent it. For example, Kashmir has been replete with stories such as these you narrated since 1947 and more so from 1989 when the armed uprising happened and when the militarization happened densely. And there was also Jammu, where 200,000 Muslims were compelled to migrate into the Pakistani side of, Kashmir from Jammu.
Shanaz, I understand this
Yes.
perfectly, but what we're looking at are ideas that we are going to put on Al Jazeera in August. That's what we're looking at, those particular stories. So I was really keen to see whether you like Malika's pitch so that we can actually add some more as well. What did you want to bring to the mix? What was your story for us?
Yeah, I mean, who can understand it better than Kashmiris who have witnessed all these years, and what happened in Kashmir, what happened in Jammu and Kashmir in 1947 itself, the fallout of the partition, that 200,000 Muslims were compelled to migrate from Jammu to the Pakistani side of Kashmir, and 300,000 were killed. And
so in our discussion format, Shanaz,
So
I'm focusing everybody in. What would be our discussion that you would suggest that we have in August? The discussion would be about...
My question would be, like, it's not a question, it's like it's a question in affirmative. Like we always say that why shouldn't we address those problems, and why should we always be unfortunately talking about sad memory? Why shouldn't we address important questions that would prevent the subcontinent from more sad episodes like the partition?
Okay, I
That's
hear
my
you.
open question to all, not only to India, not only to Pakistan
Sure.
or Kashmir, but to the whole world. I mean, why should the world... For a second, if you say that you disagree with what I say or whatever whoever says, but whenever this question is posed, you see people getting angry, at the first sight. Primarily there is no reaction, but there is anger. I mean, why isn't the latest
why?
fallout, which
Yeah.
may not be directly connected to the partition,
All right,
but
Shanaz,
is a fallout
we hear you.
directly?
Well pitched. Malika.
Well, I think people online agree with you. That's why we got several tweets referencing Kashmir. This is Mohammed, who says Kashmir is a live reminder of the violence of partition, so it should be at the center of this hashtag partition at 70. So we're keeping that in mind. I'm going to pivot just a little bit to share with you another pitch from a member of our community. This is Garga Chatterjee. He's a columnist in Calcutta, and here's his idea.
Now, the last generation of the original refugees from East Bengal to West Bengal are now dying off, and they are having this one last chance to have a look at their homestead. And there's a lot of tourism now which is happening, which is a kind of niche tourism has developed, which would take someone, make them visit their original homestead one last time before they die. And I think Al Jazeera should make a story of what underlies these very complex journeys, albeit in the form of tourism.
So Zafar, he mentions East Bengal, which of course is now Bangladesh. And really his idea is partition tourism, or going back to the place where your grandparents or your parents were born. I want to share with you this tweet. Umber says, I visited my family's historic home in Aligarh city. The current residents sent laddu, or desserts, for me to take back to Lahore. It was so cool. I got to experience the house where my dad and my dadi were born. I saw the view that they knew, and I met people who remembered them. Shahnaz, what do you make of partition tourism? Do you think that that could be a good show, seeing people following their route as they discover their roots?
Yes, the latest episode to what I just read a tweet that you just displayed, that the current what is happening in Kashmir right now, it is also directly connected with the violence that happened in the partition. Oh, yeah. So the latest is that recently a tribal, someone who lives in the peripheries of Jammu and Kashmir, was lynched in Jammu for just having sheep and cattle, to rear, and the families were compelled to migrate again to farther areas of the peripheries. So this is the latest happening in Kashmir. So I think we have to address this question, the basic fundamental questions that become reasons that explode
Shanaz,
into violent
as you're talking about addressing questions, Zafar looks like he has a question for you. Zafar, go ahead.
Now, I just wanted to actually go back to the point Garga made, and I think it ties in with the discussion earlier. I think Bina, Anam, both of them had made the same point. I think we need to be focusing on our shared humanity here, 70 years after partition, because so many of the stories one hears, the general narrative is one of doom, death, destruction, bloodshed. And Anam mentioned that 40% of the stories she has come across were rescue stories. I think that is not well known. And I think one of the ways of focusing on this is, I like Garga's idea about tourism, people going back and finding their roots across the border. I think another way of looking at this would actually be to locate families with members in 2 or even 3 countries. They still exist. And I mean, I think that's a really fascinating angle. If you show families where, in fact, half of the family might be Bangladeshi, the other half Indian, or you have the same thing between, let's say, India and Pakistan, that would really hit home. That would really send the message, I think, of shared humanity, which everyone else has been talking about in a very...
Do you know what it tends to do as well? For people who are outside of India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Kashmir, it connects them to that idea of being separated from family.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very relatable. For people who are not from there, this is something which everyone can understand. And I think, it ties in very well. People going back and seeing their ancestral homeland, people going back and connecting with family across borders. And I think there are many stories like this. I know, for instance, there are many Bangladeshis who have family across the border in what would now be West Bengal in India, and vice versa. So I think that would be something which would make fascinating television and really humanize the stories we're trying to tell.
Malika, you know what I'm hearing? I'm hearing very powerful stories. I feel like our guests and our pitchers are pitching us powerful stories, and then how we do it, it's up to us. It's our job to actually turn what they're sharing with us into a format that will work on the stream. I have to say also, pitchers, if you're pitching online or via YouTube or via Twitter, or actually our pitches here, we are going to turn one of these ideas, at least one of these ideas, into a show. And so our team is listening to your ideas, they're watching your ideas, and the one that they know is going to be a show, they will tell us at the end of this first half of our Open Editorial. Malika.
Definitely, and I'm looking forward to that. But I know that, Anam, you were nodding, you were raising your hand there because you really wanted to get in. Go ahead, Anam.
I just wanted to say that I've interviewed so many families, like Zafar is mentioning over here, where one sister is Indian or one is Pakistani, for instance. And what this really shows me is that partition is an ongoing process. It is not a static event that happened 70 years ago. It continues to impact families day in and day out. And what we also need to understand is that, or maybe question is that, in a country like Pakistan, where you still have the first generation around, where you still have the partition generation around in all of these countries that we're talking about, how is it that the younger generations are so far removed from that holistic and very nuanced? I don't want to make it romantic. It's not rosy. They're full of violent stories as well, but they're holistic, right? They're shades of gray. And how have we come to a place where it's so black and white? So I think that process also needs to be looked at. What are children learning today? Why are they learning it? How are they interpreting it? How have recent post-partition events like wars, religious fundamentalism, the Kashmir conflict started to shape our understanding of partition? And what's going to happen when we lose that first generation and we don't have those stories documented anywhere? Because state textbooks and narratives are bent upon not mentioning these stories, right? So that's scary. And I think that's something that we need to really consider at the 70th anniversary, because we're fortunate to have those people still around as walking, talking sources of that history.
Bina?
Yeah, I think I really agree with all those points. And I think the other thing that I want to say is that what Shanaz said earlier in terms of looking ahead, I think that's really important also. I was in London last October, and we had a meeting where we talked about, it was just, I'd gone for a conference, but at the end of that conference, we kind of had a separate meeting to talk about India, Pakistan particularly. And one of the things that came out in that was that we 70 years have passed. I mean, we're into the 70th year. What about 70 years ahead? Why we need to look forward at what are the next 70 years going to be like? Are we going to continue living like this?
So Bina, this is again, if you were watching this on Al Jazeera, how would you make that? How would you make that? How do you do that look ahead?
So I think that one thing that has come to my mind in recent years in the kind of work I've been doing is you look back to look forward. So you do have to look back. You can't just look either back or look either forward. I think that you need to look back to look forward, and you need to look at the entire picture, not just the very simplified black and white picture that our state narratives have provided us, but and on both sides. But we need to provide the full picture and then look ahead. How are we going to take that? Like, I think what Malika is doing at the Partition Museum is a brilliant idea, and it's something that we've been saying, many people have been saying for a long time, have a memorial. We need to memorialize partition so we can move ahead, because we've never memorialized it. We've never acknowledged it, really. I mean, it's acknowledged, half acknowledged. Like our people only learn, like Anam said, they only learn about the bad side of the other side. So I think it's really important to look back and look forward.
I like the looking back and looking forward. We got a pitch from Sandeep Roy, who really, he's echoing what you said, but I'll have you take a listen to what he told us.
And also a show that looked at young people today, born 40, 50 years after partition. What do they think of partition now?
So, of course, that's picking up on what you mentioned, Anam, which is why I happen to like your pitch. But I'm pivoting a little bit. This is Taha. This is another pitch. He says, what people don't realize is how involved China has been in the conflict post-partition. They have a claim on Kashmir. They have increased ties with Pakistan. There's a China-Pakistan economic corridor. So looking at China's role post-partition, 70 years post-partition, I'm wondering what you all think of that. Malika, what do you think of that pitch?
I mean, I think, China's role in the world is very interesting. And certainly in India, there is always a question of how it's aligning with Pakistan. But I personally feel there has been a lot said about that already. So I'm not quite sure what would be the new angle that, is being proposed to be discussed on that, because we do know that there is the corridor.
Okay. Bina, do you think that it's been done? It's talked about. Everyone knows China's role.
I'm not so sure. I think that there's a lot of I don't know how much people know. We know that China's involved, but I think it's not a bad idea, definitely, to bring it in and to explain what it means. And actually, I've heard a lot of Kashmiris say that they think that China's involvement now, they're looking forward to it as a possible way to break out of the impasse. But I haven't really got my head around the angle of how and why.
Sure.
So that might not be a bad thing to look at, for sure, yeah.
Let me show you something here I've got on my laptop. It's called the Partition Museum Project. It's one of the things that Malika is actually working on. Let me show you a little clip here from a lady called Indira. It kind of sums up what we've been doing so far on the stream today.
I'm very happy that you are putting it together. I think it's high time that this whole enormous division of this country and all the fallout, it has to be documented and it has to be taught in our history to the younger generations who didn't live through that time, because you can't just wipe it out and say it never happened.
So on the week of August the 14th, we are committed on the stream to take a look at partition 70 years on, the Partition of India 70 years on. So I think this has been a shared effort. We're actually looking at our control room right now. Have a look to see what the control room actually loved as the idea. They like Safar's idea. That's our senior producer, Maya Gar, saying it's Safar's idea of shared humanity. But I really think all of our panelists kind of picked up on that, and our online pictures as well. We are not done yet. We have so many more stories to share with you. So stay online with us at stream.aljazeera.com. You will see that story of shared humanity coming up on August on the stream. But right now we will continue online looking at Partition 70. What ideas would you like us to cover? Thanks for watching. See you online in a minute. Hello again, this is our stream's on-air pitch meeting, and we are planning coverage for our 70th anniversary of the Partition of India and Pakistan. Being a little bit cheeky because we're actually asking experts in their field to help us out. I want to go to Anam's idea here, because Anam, you were talking about the idea of not everybody really knows about partition, that there are some people who are growing up who don't really understand it. But what about the rest of the world? How would you include them in a show that teaches about partition and why it's still important?
I think what's really struck me is when I wrote my book, a lot of people from different places I would have never expected in the world reached out to me and said, you know, we can relate. Because end of the day, like Zafar also said, these are stories of humanity, right? And so telling them through personal histories of people is the way to help the world understand as well, to help the world empathize and be compassionate about those stories. So for instance, a sister who's Indian and a sister is Pakistani, what happens when war breaks out? Right? What happens to your own identity? What happens to that distance, to not being able to see each other? Similarly, you know, I think when you're working with school children, trying to understand the animosity that is breeding between them,
oh my goodness,
just go into a history classroom.
That's the elephant in the room. We didn't actually even talk about that, the animosity that still exists.
Yeah.
70 years on, people who weren't even born at the time. Can you
and it's worse.
Put that into words for us? Can you tell us who are outside of India and Pakistan what that really means?
Yeah, sure. So what I found in my research is that the further you move away from partition, the more hardline opinions are becoming. And I'll give you two little anecdotes, one from Pakistan and one from India. So I had taken this Pakistani student delegation with me to India, and the school, you know, the principal moved forward to put a tika as well wishes and to greet us. And three of the children, who were, you know, about 9-10 years old, started to cry. And asked them what happened, and they said, have we become Hindu too? Because we heard that Hindus would forcibly convert Muslims to their religion. Is that what's happening? So you have this kind of, almost this fear and paranoia of the other. And while I was in Mumbai, you know, I had a 6-year-old student run away from me when I said I'm from Pakistan, because he said, I'm scared of Ajmal Kasab, who was responsible for the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Yeah. So you have kids under the age of 10 having so much hostility. You know, they've already made up their mind where the Indian is the deceitful, mischievous one, because that's exactly the term that's used in textbooks, and the Muslim is the barbaric savage. So that's how bad it is. And they are not even willing to talk to each other a lot of times. So you have to break through so many stereotypes.
We actually got a tweet with someone who is showing what that looked like for her. This is Sarah. She says, the biases we inherited, tales of the communal violence of partition, were passed to generations, and those perceptions were then shaped by those biases. So just like you were saying, these deeply entrenched thoughts about people on the other side. But Zafar, I'm wondering if that's the same thing for you. Did you have biases growing up about Indians versus Pakistanis? And how did your role as a Bangladeshi, how did that fit into that role?
I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I think those tales certainly exist in Bangladesh because, of course, in 1947, Bangladesh was not immune to these forces being at that time East Pakistan and before that time East Bengal. But switching up a little, I was wondering if I could pitch another story.
Of course, this is why you're here.
Okay, is that, I mean, I think the key stories of partition are really stories of dislocation, stories of peoples being marginalized. And if you're talking about people who've been marginalized, what strikes me, coming at it from a Bangladeshi perspective, is to actually look at a community in Bangladesh who are variously known as stranded Pakistanis, Biharis. I mean, these are, in 1947, the non-Bengalis who migrated to what was then East Pakistan. And then after our War of Independence in 1971, they essentially, I think there were about 500,000 of them, 170,000 in time were repatriated back to Pakistan because these were people who identified with Pakistan, thought of themselves as Pakistanis, but the rest of them have remained in Bangladesh in camps, in really, fairly parlous circumstances. In between, they're not. You have a 2008 Supreme Court ruling in Bangladesh which makes them full Bangladeshi citizens, but at the same time they still face striking discrimination, striking lack of opportunity, and total integration with the Bangladesh is not really there. At the same time, I think Pakistan Supreme Court decisions say that they don't see any reason or need to take them back, although initially I think that was the idea.
Zafar, I'm going to show some people.
71.
I'm going to show our audience a picture story, a picture essay from the Guardian newspaper. Stranded Pakistanis living in camps in Bangladesh in pictures.
Sure.
I'm going to scroll through some of these pictures. I'm just wondering, is this an underreported story or a story that everybody talks about but nobody cares about? How would you categorize it?
It's interesting. It's hard for me to say. My suspicion would be that outside of Bangladesh, it is perhaps underreported. I'm not sure that too many people are aware of it. I think it is a great human tragedy, and it's an ongoing human tragedy, and I think really lays bare a lot of the contradictions, problems, dislocations of partition in a very human way. And I think this is a community which does deserve more airtime. This is a community which is in many ways been left behind by partition.
So here's
what has happened since then.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to come in over here because I was very recently doing research on this, and in Karachi in Pakistan, you actually have Biharis who did move, but still don't have the state ID card. So they're still even stateless here. They're in a smaller number, but what you have in a larger number are actually Bengalis who are stateless.
Sure.
So I visited them, and similarly, they're living in camps and in terrible conditions. So that is definitely an angle that perhaps we could look into at the 70th year, other people who are still stateless and have not found a home in either land.
Malika, what did you want to say? What did you want to add? Go ahead.
So even outside of Calcutta, I have read of a camp that's about 200 kilometers at Calcutta where there's a similar kind of population that even 60 years after partition has not managed to assimilate fully into the Indian state. They don't have documents. And I think the reason this story will resonate with a lot of people is that actually one of the things that's unusual about partition is that even though it was the largest migration in human history, most of the refugees were welcomed in a sense by the state they were moving to, right? So which you would say is very different from the refugee situation today, where states are like, no, we don't want more refugees. But there are these smaller groups where that was not the case, where they continued to face that displacement. And, I think Anam and Zafar have highlighted cases of that continuing till today. And so I think this is an interesting story because it also fits in very well with what is happening in the world just now. And that global sense of displacement with the Syrian crisis. And so I think in the sense you were saying earlier, what is the connect with an international audience? I think a lot of them would really, would be very moved by hearing of people who 70 years after an event are still trying to find their home, having lost theirs one.
Bina.
The only thing with that, I think, is that it's not 70 years. This is actually a 1971 partition story. This is a story that is definitely needs to be covered, and I agree with Zafar, it's undercovered, and it's a huge tragedy that there are people who are, such a large number are stateless, but they became stateless after 1971, not 1947.
That is a very good point.
Technical point.
It's about I suppose about the legacy of partition, but if being absolutely historically correct, that is a story that doesn't connect necessarily directly to 1947.
47. It connects to 1971.
Yeah.
It connects to 1971.
Good point.
But it is part of that. But I think a story from 1947 that still
Though
resonates.
the Cooper's camp in West Bengal is 47.
So okay.
Bina, finish your thought. Yeah, finish your thought.
Yeah.
Can I come in here?
Let Bina finish her thought, and then we're going to go back to Malika.
Well, I mean, if we can finish discussing that particular story, but I wanted to bring up another sort of a division, and it goes back to what Anam was saying about the divided families, the divided sisters. I came across this story, and we used the map from that as a cover for Aman Ki Asha's Facebook page for some time. It was a story done in the by a young Pakistani photojournalist and a young Indian journalist. And it's the story of a woman who hadn't seen her mother in 45 years. And her mother was on the Indian side of Kashmir, and this woman was called Zeba. Her name was Zeba. And she was on the Pakistani side of Kashmir. And their villages are only 35 kilometers apart or something like that. But she had to travel 3,000 kilometers to go see her mother after she eventually got a visa, which took her 45 years to do that. And she went, but by the time she got to her mother, having gone from Kashmir on the Pakistan side to Islamabad to Lahore to Delhi to Srinagar and to the other side, and her mother was blind by then, and on her deathbed literally, and that just it was so wrenching to see this and these are the poorest people, the most disenfranchised people who don't have resources. The people who have resources meet in third countries. They go to Dubai, or they meet in the States, or they meet in England or wherever. But people who are really poor, who have a hard time even going to a different city in their own country, for them to go to the other country, it's almost impossible. I think one of the biggest problems of that partition has left us with, like Anam said, it's an ongoing thing, but at the same time, you have, the visa issue is so, it's becoming even more difficult now than it was before. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at, that, why are these countries, why is it so impossible for me as a Pakistani to get a visa for India and vice versa? And it's not just about divided families. Why can we not be like the EU? Why can we not look at soft borders and trade? We're trading, and that's another actually part of it, is the trade, that we are losing billions of dollars by trading through third countries rather than direct trade across the border. Sorry, that's
I like that you mentioned the trade on the border, because I know that this is something that's come up often in our community, but I don't know how interesting it is for a TV show. So I want to get your idea on that. I want to pick your brain. This is Umran Chowdhury. He's a law student in Dhaka, and this is his pitch.
I want AJ Stream to do a show on the effects of partition in the eastern part of the subcontinent. Partition resulted in 54 transboundary rivers divided between Bangladesh and India, and water sharing has been a problem. Partition also cut off transport and economic links, and reviving those old links can stimulate prosperity and remove mistrust.
So Zafar, he talks about transport, he talks about water issues. We know these things are important, but would you watch a 30-minute show on them?
Well, it wouldn't have
I think there's a way to make that interesting.
There is?
Yeah, go ahead,
Because
Donna.
I wouldn't watch that show. You can do that when I'm on vacation.
No, like my pitch. My pitch is this actually M.J. Akbar, who was once a journalist and is now a very eminent politician in India, talks about the three partitions of the subcontinent. You got 1947, we all know about. 1971, there was a further partition with the birth of Bangladesh. But the real partition he talks about actually happened in 1965 with the Indo-Pakistan War, because up until then, the borders were open and people could go back and forth relatively easily. That's what changed everything. This is what Bina was talking about in terms of trade ties, in terms of getting a visa. And I think that's really what the new generation of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis are really interested in and would like to see, is if there's any way we could go back to those pre-1965 days. From 47 to 65, there was free movement between the Indian subcontinent. And I think for a new generation, it would be really interesting to explore why that closed down and whether that could be opened up and what would the implications be for all of us.
And I should say that just general infrastructure shows are very difficult to do. Shows about infrastructure and road and water. It's very hard to make them engaging, but they're incredibly important.
No, but look, water. I mean, look, there was a ferry between Bombay and Karachi. There was a ferry that ran between Bombay and Karachi until past 70. Until it stopped after the 65 war, but then was resumed again, and then the last ferry was somewhere in early 1984 or something like that. A ferry between Bombay and Karachi. There were railway links between the people of Rajasthan and Sindh in Pakistan. These are historic links, like the Bangladeshi pitch said, and also like rivers. Rivers don't have borders. The water doesn't have borders. We have fishermen every year. Every month, India and Pakistan are arresting each other's fishermen for crossing the maritime boundary without a visa. Please, for God's sake, this is so ridiculous. They catch them, they put them in prison, they have no access to lawyers, they're there for years, their families don't know where they are. When they're eventually repatriated, somebody's like, oh, very kindly decides to repatriate them. They're not sent back via the water route from Karachi to Bombay and on to their areas, and vice versa. They sent all the way to Lahore, 1,000 miles up north, and then by rail or across the border, and then again down south. It's so ridiculous.
Let me just check in with Malika. How are people reacting and pitching? Are they liking what they hear? Are they saying, I can do better than that?
Well, they're watching us live on YouTube and on our own site, and they are commenting. Most of them are pitching their own pitches, but I think they're listening as well. Because here's one person who listened to Anam, your pitch from a little bit earlier. This is Haroon Khalid, who is a pretty prolific writer on history in both India and Pakistan. Haroon writes in, I am an educationist, and I think Anam's idea is fascinating. It's essential to look at how partition is taught in schools on both sides. Taking Zafar and Anam's idea forward, we could also look at how some of these same historical events are taught in these three countries, and what role does education play in fomenting this animosity? All nations go through this nation-making process. So, Anam, he really liked your idea. Do you see that as a full show? Because earlier, and you could take a look at my laptop here, this was a web piece we did back in 2015, and it got a lot of interest. It was Partition, Rewriting History, and we took a look back at textbooks in both India and in Pakistan to see how they taught about the other side. People love history. Is there a way to do this into a show?
I think so. I think if you go into a classroom and you kind of just film, secondary school, government school, and a private school in all three countries, teaching partition, teaching 71, teaching about Kashmir, for instance, and just look at those disparities, follow it up with interviews with those teachers and students. And then what else you can do is juxtapose it with oral histories, right? So oral histories of those same events to kind of show that disconnect. And actually in Pakistan, a lot of civil society actors are now working on changing textbooks and creating dissent against this mainstream narrative. So you have this history project, and you could interview people behind that go in and teach narratives from India and Pakistan, but in an interactive way and a holistic way, and get the students to actually engage in that discourse. Another really interesting thing that you could add is, after you film the students learning history, get them to Skype with each other, get them to ask questions, get them to, have like a live Skype interaction and just see what comes out of it. I love doing that with Indian students, and you move from a place where they think you're all murderers and terrorists to a place where they say, can we come visit you within 1 hour? And that is always so refreshing, where you get to humanize the other. So I think history would be a great way to, because that's how, that, like Beena said, it's looking back to look forward, right? So we need to look at our history in order to figure out how to go forward.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Yeah, I just want to connect to what Anam already said very nicely. I mean, being a writer, I think Anam would also agree to the fact that writers do understand more than anybody else the importance of documenting and recording the memories, the horrific memories of whatever tragedies we have had. So in order to educate the younger generation and to make them feel about what kind of tragic past we have all had, but always for for understanding that how should it pave a path for future. Like Beena rightly said that we have to look forward, but I would just add one small point, rather clause to the sentence, that we have to look forward, keeping intact and keeping in mind the hindsight, that we cannot look forward without asking difficult, uncomfortable questions, that we should agree with each other. I have a little anecdote about, you shared a lot of stories about it, which is very important, from Kashmir side, that there was this guy who came from the Pakistan side of Kashmir to meet his aunt to Kashmir, in Indian side of Kashmir, some 20 years ago, and he was detained here under Public Safety Act for 17 years, and nobody knew what happened to him. And it was later when people started going to jails and documenting what was happening to the detainees, we came to know about the person, and the person spent 27 years of his life in a Kashmiri jail. So this is a story that is, that traces its path to the partition. So again, I mean, people may like it or not, and it may sound incongruous, but it's as natural as anything. Like, after all the history, the sad history, the narration, what happened in the past, we cannot do away with asking difficult questions, that what can be done to prevent such bad episodes happen in future. So we have to consider problems that are brushed under the carpet, but are very important to resolve with
let me ask you about this, because
so that we can move forward.
What I'm really curious about is Kashmir is such a difficult issue to discuss, to even get people to come on TV to talk about it. Who would you have on a show where you're saying, let's address the difficult questions? On your dream guest list, who would be on that show?
Yes. See, whatever has happened from 1947 till date, it is the from Indian side, I would like to have the representatives of Indian government from both ruling as well as opposition, because both of them are responsible for anything that has happened and for the future, course of action also. So it could not be a person A, B, or C. It could be any representative from the government who has to be answerable. I mean, how long can we stretch? Why should we unfortunately be talking all the times about what has happened to us? Why shouldn't we also have a future in which we would write that how we resolve it, how writers, artists, and politicians as well, who have also a moral responsibility to come forward. We as artists and writers, frequently forget that that politician has to be kept aside, because we politicians
do not have a
have
moral side to solving disputes. But it is the politician who has to come forward. It is the person who is administering a certain powerful government that has a duty to be sincere and resolve issues which lead to bad and sad episodes like partition.
All right, Shanaz and Bina, Zafar, Anam and Malika, thank you so much for lending your expertise, your excellent pitches and your storytelling to help us design a whole week of programming looking at Partition 70 years on. Malika?
I'll end with a couple of rapid fire pitches via YouTube, and those watching live there. We got a pitch to cover the Christians in Pakistan. The next pitch is from Sana on Twitter. She says she wants us to look at the Baluchistan conflict in Pakistan, something the stream has covered several times, but it might be time to take another look. And this last one is just something to keep in mind from Nida. Let's talk about partition not as a singular event, but as a slowly unfolding and painful process.
Thank you, guests, for being part of our Open Editorial. We really appreciate it. Tune back in, obviously, every week that we're on, but particularly the week of August the 14th, and you can see the fruits of your endeavours then. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.